Hi everyone, welcome back to the TEFL Training Institute podcast, the bite-sized podcast for language teachers, trainers and managers. This week, our guest is Rod Bolitho. Rod is a freelance ELT trainer and consultant. Rod recently worked as academic director at Norwich Institute of Language Education, which I know many of you are familiar with, and has directed and taught on master's courses at both Niall and in Plymouth. Rod's also worked as a consultant all over the world in places like Russia, Romania, Belarus, Tunisia, and Uzbekistan. Rod's also a prolific author, and some of his books include Discover English with Brian Tomlinson, Trainer Development with Tony Wright, Continuing Professional Development with Amol Padwad, and most recently, Language Education in a Changing World, Challenges and Opportunities with Richard Rossner. In this week's episode, I asked Rod about relationships with materials. So in the episode, we talk about teachers' relationships with materials, learners' relationship with materials, how materials relate to the syllabus, and how teachers should relate to teachers' guides. Enjoy the interview. Hi Rod, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us. To start off with, can you tell us about the relationship between the sort of three main parties in the classroom: teachers, students, and materials?
If we start with the relationship that a teacher has with the materials, and then I'll go on to look at the triangular relationship, which you've alluded to. A teacher generally needs to have something in her hand. I mean, if you're teaching 25 hours a week, you can't be expected to write all your own material. You need to have something in your hand when you go into the classroom, something which has been structured, something which has been prepared, so that you can use it as a basis for what you do in the classroom. That can be a blessing for a teacher, but it can also be a curse. It's a blessing when the teacher sees the material as a jumping off point or a starting point, which can be developed in that complex environment called the classroom in a variety of different ways. It becomes a curse when the teacher is tied down by the material and sees the textbook as the syllabus and the Bible. That raises the distinction between teaching with the textbook and teaching through the textbook. When you're teaching through the textbook, what you can see then is the teacher actually doing everything the textbook requires and nothing else. When you're teaching with the textbook, you may have it open for some of the lesson, you may have it closed for some of the lesson, but whatever you do, you refer to it and then you leave it, and you refer to it and then you leave it. So the textbook becomes a jumping off point.
And then can you tell us a bit about students, Rod? Like, how do they play into the equation, and what's the relationship between learners and materials?
In terms of relationship with the learners, I think they also need something to hold on to during a language class. They need it for all sorts of reasons, for security. They need it also for the feeling of progression. They need it for catching up if they have to miss some classes for some reason. So they need a textbook for all those reasons. And my take on this is that a good textbook should be accessible both to the teacher and to the learner. And it shouldn't be a book which can only be understood by the learner if the teacher mediates it. So a good textbook will have accessibility for the learner, and the learner will be able to make use of it independently of the teacher when they need to. So it, again, I keep coming back to complexity, but it is a complex relationship, and it's not a single track relationship that we're talking about here. A good textbook will be multifaceted. It will provide challenge for learners. It will also provide most of what a teacher needs to get a lesson started and running, but it won't provide everything because the textbook writer doesn't know the teacher's learners. Only the teacher knows her own learners, and she'll be able to build the bridge from the textbook to the students and to help them to use the textbook in a way which is productive for them. Just one last thing there. I really do believe that a good textbook will also provide opportunities for creativity, that a good textbook will not stick only to a pure linguistic syllabus, but which will contain stimuli for critical thinking, for thinking outside the box, for doing things which are intellectually challenging and creative for students. And a good teacher will seize on that kind of thing and will make use of it in the classroom.
So going back to that distinction you made earlier between teaching through the textbook versus teaching with the textbook, why do you think it is that so often teachers end up teaching through the textbook or put the textbook at the center of all those relationships in the classroom?
I think there are many different reasons. One reason is definitely that if you're teaching 25 hours a week, your opportunities for creativity in the classroom seem to go down in inverse proportion to the number of hours you have to teach a week. That's one reason. Another reason, I think, is because training courses don't always deal with how to use the textbook more creatively and not to be tied to the textbook. Still, another reason, I think, is teachers' security as well. They feel secure with the book, insecure without it. In the case of some of the non-native teachers that I've worked with, they don't feel that they have the spontaneous command of English, which would enable them to take a lot of risks with their students in the classroom. So to use open-ended activities where they can't predict what language the students are going to use. And I think the textbook sometimes constrains and narrows down the language options which are available to both teacher and to students. So I think all of those reasons, plus I think teachers on the whole don't read syllabus documents. For them, the textbook is the syllabus. It's what they need from day to day. A good syllabus will, of course, go way beyond the textbook. The textbook may be based on a syllabus, but it can't cover everything which is in a syllabus. And a good syllabus will be multifaceted and will challenge both teachers and learners in different ways, So there's that relationship between the syllabus and the textbook. And then finally, if the textbook has an examination orientation and the students are preparing for a public exam or even for an internal examination, and the textbook is seen as the means of that preparation, then everybody will stick to it more.
You mentioned the syllabus there. It's funny, I think syllabus and curricula are words that, we're certainly familiar with. But I think for a lot of teachers, you maybe really don't come into much contact with those. And as you mentioned earlier, you might really just think of the course book as being the same as the syllabus. So what is the relationship between the course book and the syllabus?
I think what's interesting is that a syllabus is very often derived from a broader school curriculum. And a school curriculum typically is a statement of educational objectives for a whole system, obviously, not just for one subject. And it's all about the aspirations of a government, of an administration for the future citizens of the country. When that's all there in a curriculum document, it becomes essential that some of these curriculum objectives are reflected in single subject syllabuses. And in the subject syllabuses, the aspirations need to be put into practice for that particular subject area. So you'd be looking at the development of life skills, 21st century skills, for example, in the big curriculum document. How is that going to be realized in an English language syllabus? And from there, the textbooks need to pick up on all aspects of what's in the syllabus if they're going to be used successfully and if they're going to mirror the curriculum demands. So there's, I think, quite a difficult relationship between the three stages in a public education system, between the curriculum, between the subject syllabus, And then the textbooks have to provide the means of going there.
Rod, I've also heard you talk before about the problems with teachers' guides and how teachers' guides can sometimes do too much for teachers. In my experience, one of the biggest issues with writing materials is that they're used by such a variety of teachers with varying levels of skill and experience and background knowledge. And it can be very difficult to provide materials that are going to work for all those teachers. So what are some of the dangers with giving teachers materials which give too much support?
Yeah. It is a really difficult thing. Infantilizing for me would occur when a teacher's guide, for example, contains lesson plans. Not just notes on a lesson, but worked out lesson plans, which a teacher can take as classroom ready without thinking about them. And to me, that has the impact of deprofessionalizing, de-skilling a teacher. Every teacher needs to be able to plan their own lessons. That's a must. So a teacher's guide which is full of lesson plans might look like an attractive solution to a novice teacher maybe, or a lazy teacher. But in the end, what kind of teacher is that who just lifts lesson plans from a teacher's guide? I go back to my point earlier that the textbook authors, there's no way that they know the students' needs in the class that the teacher is teaching. What the teacher's guide needs to offer a teacher is suggestions. It needs to offer answer keys for closed convergent exercises. For the more open-ended exercises, it may want to offer a few lines of guidance as to how to deal with feedback on student output after a role play or after a pair work or a group work or a project or something like this. But it shouldn't be leading the teacher by the nose through the course book. Just one more thing related to that. I think what teachers also love in a teacher's guide, especially non-native teachers, is little bits of extra cultural and linguistic information which are not in the student's book, but which enable the teacher to feed in extra value into the learning experience of the learners. If there is, for example, a text which is somehow historical in a student's book, something about the American War of Independence or something like this, a little bit of background information in the teacher's book would really, really help. Or if there's a literary text, maybe a poem or something like that, in the teacher's guide, some information about the author, the time, the era when the author was writing, and so on, which doesn't need to be in the student's book, but which the teacher can offer the students if she has that information to hand. So I think a good teacher's guide will probably also provide suggestions for follow-up work, for optional activities for more able students or less able students, this kind of thing. Basically, it should be offering a rich menu, but not something to be followed slavishly.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think there's a lot of schools that I've seen which now kind of aim to do all the planning for teachers. And the thinking behind this, I think, is that if we're paying teachers, we might as well have them doing something that generates money, like i.e. teaching. So for some schools, if teachers are sitting around planning, they're not generating money. But I think the problem with that is students are obviously not going to get something that's really tailored to their needs. And obviously the teacher's role is kind of reduced to something more like a technician, really.
Yeah. No, it's really important. I mean, a teacher needs to have a capacity for critical evaluation of textbooks. And, if they don't have that critical evaluation capacity, they can't use the textbook in a creative and enlightened way.
One more time, everyone, that was Rod Bolitho. If you enjoyed that and you'd like to find out more from Rod, check out the books I mentioned at the top of the show, especially Language Education in a Changing World, Rod's most recent book. For more podcasts, check out our website, www.tefltraininginstitute.com. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please give us a good rating on iTunes or wherever you listen. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you again next time. Goodbye.